Hi, welcome to our first training session of what's going to be 2 very exciting weeks for the Open Security Summit. You have an amazing session today, which is actually part of 4 sessions that we're going to do at the summit, and James will go into the detail. I just want to give you a welcome, just walk you very through quickly some rules of engagement, and to really sort of reinforce the kind of concepts and what we're trying to do here at the summit. James, if you move it. So the key thing here, right, is that we're really trying to do a big focus on learning, right? So it's going to be a 10-day sort of high energy experience, right? All about collaboration, all about practitioners lead some training sessions, and ideally we should be trying to create solutions for real world problems, and we're trying to make most of these sessions as real world as possible. Ideally, we want to make them so that we create artifacts and questions and challenges, so that when we have the main summit in 2 weeks from now, we can kind of take a lot of those discoveries, a lot of that work to the next level. So what we expect from you, James, if you flip through, thank you. So basically, we want you to participate, right? It's very important that you feel engaged. It's very important that you remember that the whole point of the summit is for you, right? We kind of we care deeply about all of you. We care deeply about making sure that we create a great environment for you to learn, but also we want you to care about this environment and share as much as possible. It's very important that we have a lot of respect from each other. This is something that we can't stress enough. We're multicultural, multi-geography, multi-experiences, multi-age, multi-everything, right? And it's about being respectful, having an objective distance from point of view, being able to challenge, but also be challenged. And we will have actually very little tolerance for any kind of abuses of that. And I'll come back in a second, but it's very important for you to understand that we really care about creating a great experience for you. And ideally, let's focus on solutions. I think in security, sometimes it's very easy for us to go on all sorts of challenges and tangents. So let's really focus on trying to get some good solutions and to learn a lot, right? James? The key concept of the summit is openness. So we really believe in open source, we believe in sharing everything. And just to reinforce that, every single session at the summit will be video recorded using Zoom. We'll publish on YouTube, and some of them we're going to try to live stream. So if you don't want to be identified, don't put your name, don't put the video, don't speak, right? But it's very important that realize that everything we put here is going to be shared, and ideally, right, at least everything we create, but everything that's shared should be done under Creative Commons or an open source license. And respect is fundamental, right? Now, we're here to collaborate. We all care about this. Nobody should be discriminated or harassed based on their race, gender, age, religious experience, whatever, right? We'll expect to retain a good level of professionalism. And again, if you feel that any kind of abuse behavior, yourself or somebody else, reach out to some of the organizers, which you'll see me, Lidar, James, everybody on the Slack channel that is on the organization team. Please reach out, and we'll take action on it, because this is very, very important for us. Next one. So finally, right, share your views, share your ideas, propagate the thoughts, tweet a lot. It would be good to get this trending, right? We have a Slack channel. If you haven't joined, you should join. The link is there. We'll put this presentation on the chat here, and fundamentally learn, right? This is what we're here for. We're here to collaborate, and you're here to learn, and we are here to learn, right? Because the best way to learn sometimes is to teach, and we're all here to learn from each other. So thank you. Thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the time, and over to you, James.
Okay, let me just switch around on the slides.
I want to just jump in and ask if, James, are you comfortable people asking the questions as they come, or do you want them to be answered at a certain point?
No, throw them in as and when you think of them, whether it's in chat, in which case I might completely miss them if I'm not paying attention, or just shout them out, so long as it doesn't get too chaotic.
Mhm.
I'm
I will be
happy to deal
monitoring
with questions, however.
for you.
Okay, there we go. I've also put a file in the chat, which is 1.png. You'll want that later on for the first of the exercises. So basically, this is going to be a workshop, the first one of the summit, so a bit experimental, on threat modeling, and whether you spell it with 1 or 2 L's, because there's huge arguments about that. We're going to be looking at a completely fictional company with no real world parallels, who offer an aggregated management platform across Office 365, AWS, and Azure. So they make use of the API to integrate with the different cloud providers and do reporting, etc., etc. Definitely no real world parallels with Acme MSP there. But a bit about threat modeling, or at least my view of it first, others will disagree. There seem to be 3 families that threat modeling methods fall into. There's the library based, there's those which are focused much more on the goals of the threat, and there's those which are focused much more on motivation. And there's combinations of these. There's frameworks which try to incorporate all of them. There's individual ones which may have more thorough libraries or less thorough libraries. Ultimately, though, you can break all of the ones that I've researched down into one of those 3 or a combination of them. And the first one, the one that most people are familiar with, is the list and library method. So that's where you have a taxonomy of some kind, a list of threat categories, down to a list of individual threats. So you could use the entire set of CVEs as your threat library if you wanted to. Arguably, it's a vulnerability, but it's not a vulnerability unless it applies to your environment. So until you've clarified that, it's a threat. It's out of your control. Some of the most well-known list and library methods are Stride and a variant on that called Striped, originally developed by Microsoft and no longer used by them, which is just an acronym for different threat categories. Striped sticks privacy in there and pretends it's something new. There's LINDDUN, which is a very privacy-focused method, but similar approach, where you're looking instead at linkability of information, identifiability, non-repudiation of actions, etc., etc. The OWASP top 10 or other OWASP libraries are also used as threat libraries and in threat modeling. There's one set called security cards, and you can play a sort of poker with them. There's also a game you can play with the Stride elevation of privilege cards and OWASP cornucopia, which I highly recommend getting out on game night. Then there's the various threat taxonomies. So there's the ENISA threat taxonomy, there's the MITRE attack framework, and many, many, many others. There's plenty out there. There's more every day. And it's because trying to apply one of these methods as a one-size-fits-all is never going to work. It's highly dependent on the organization you're in and the type of systems you're working with. So you need to bear that in mind. But given those, we're going to actually crack on with a threat modeling exercise just to get everyone warmed up, and this will probably be the most in-depth one. So if we go with Stride, because it's the easiest to remember, you will have a diagram which is currently sitting in chat, and it's 1.png. And the way that Stride works, if I can, there we go. You identify zones of trust. This is quite common in different threat modeling methodologies. So we've got the internal stuff, which is the API secret store, API integration engine, the management portal. All of these are what we consider internal to the zone of trust. We've then got some external bits which are still trusted, such as the AWS identity store, IAM, and Azure AD, which is another identity store, and the external APIs. So we consider them trusted, but you have to cross an untrusted area to get to it. And the same with the customer and the Acme admins. Our management portal is extremely well defined, and general users access through the same interface as admins. So we're relying purely on permissions to separate them. Now, since we're using Stride, the way that this would normally be approached is identifying any exchanges that cross that line of trust or cross between a trusted and untrusted zone. So the synchronization from the IAM store crosses to AWS IAM. At some point in there, it's going across untrusted infrastructure and it's changing between different trust levels. So you look at that, say that's a point of potential weakness, that's a potential vulnerability, that's part of our attack surface. And with Stride, you just go through the acronym and list out any relevant threats. And ultimately, this is what you're doing with absolutely any list or library-based method. You can do it by category, you can do it by individual low-level technical threats, you can do it in all sorts of different ways, and you can do it using some of the methods we're going to come to later to narrow your focus and save time. But it's basically a brainstorming exercise. And in a few minutes, after we've dealt with any questions, I'm going to drop you all into breakout rooms where if you run through and just brainstorm different threats against different vulnerability points, I will be hopping in and out of the rooms to help out, as will, I'm sure, others on the call. List them out and you can submit them however you want. You don't have to submit them at all, but you can drop them into chat, you can tweet them at us, however you want to do it. But we're trying to build up a list of threats that we then need to take on to the next level. So if we say about 15 minutes in the rooms, and I'll see you all in 15 minutes or earlier. Are there any questions before I do that?
Can you re-clarify what you expect people to do in the breakout room?
Yes. So in the breakout room, if you work with whoever's in the room with you, so discuss with them, and you're trying to identify what possible threats might apply to different areas where data flows cross that line of trust. So to take an example, the user IAM store synchronizing with the AWS IAM. There you're crossing an untrusted area. It's possible that the Stride acronym is spoofing. So there's potentially spoofing that could happen there with someone trying to intercept the data. There's tampering. Obviously, someone might modify the data that's going through. Repudiation, well, that overlaps with many of the others, but failure to properly log. Information disclosure, if someone intercepts it, pulls out that identity data and any security information around it. Denial of service, all sorts of ways that could happen, and then your identity store suddenly stops working and doesn't synchronize properly. And elevation of privilege, if somehow someone uses that to escalate their account from a standard user account to an admin account, anything along those lines. The only reason for using the acronym is to direct the conversation, direct the brainstorming. And this can be done with any of these, and you can use any other acronym. I simply go with Stride because it's one of the most well-known and one of the easiest to work with. Are there any questions? Either in chat or just jump onto voice if you need to.
Don't be shy.
If you'd like to ask a question while we're hopping through the rooms, then feel free to ask then. I'm going to put 5 or 6 of you in each room, and you should get the invite for that shortly.
I have a question.
Oh,
do we get the slides you're showing right now?
You should have. Yeah, you should have in the chat window 1.png available to you, and that's the diagram that we're looking at right now.
Okay, thanks.
So let's give people 10, 20 seconds just to download that.
Yeah. Also, if you've got any questions about how this theoretical system actually works, yes, I can share the file again. There we go. If you've got any questions about the technical implementation of the system, anything like that, feel free to come up with your own answer. It doesn't matter whether it's running on a sitting on a bespoke Java service, whether it's running over Lambda functions, however you want to say it's implemented, that's entirely up to you. If it's an area you know well, great, use that. If it's not, you can use more abstract, higher level threats and do the same sort of work.
Cool. I think we're ready for the breakout rooms.
Okay. So everyone should have an invite, and I will hop between rooms.
Hello.
Hello.
So
Hi, everyone.
ease, I think I'm gonna just share this so that we can all see it together.
Hi, this is Venkat. Now I'll be calm most of the session today. This is the first time I'm logging into this event. So I'll be a bit more silent. I'm not normally a silent guy. I'm trying to,
No, we don't want you silent. We want you to have your ideas, opinions as well, because I'm not a threat modeling expert. To be fair, I have not really done it myself. So
same here. So I've not done my homework, so I don't want to be an idiot in speaking out things like that.
So that's why we're all here. We're all here to learn. So no right or wrong answers. So I think he's given us like 15 minutes or something. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Because the way Zoom works, I can't see it. I can't see that it is being shared. So
we can see.
And I don't think we can use the chat here. There is no chat. So okay. So the stride method, not method, framework: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. So we're talking about the line of trust.
Right.
And the IAM store, I think that's an easier point to start. Firstly, does anybody have experience with threat modeling that wants to lead? I think you have.
Yeah,
some,
I can.
right?
Yeah, I can moderate the session. Yep.
Thank you.
Trying actually to understand this diagram, like what happens here. So, so the users authenticate to the user IAM store, right? And then they can manage the keys through the management portal. Do I understand the diagram well?
Yeah, I think so the line of trust, the ones that are outside of line of trust, there are two different elements. One part is the customer's AWS API, their Office 365, their Azure, because this is a service managed services company. They have their clients, and then they have their own admins who might be outside of the network. And I think that's the Azure AD and AWS IAM, which is on the right-hand side. So the right-hand side is our own admins in the company. The left-hand side is our clients, admins, and users.
Okay, I would suggest to start with who in general could attack the system. So the threat actors, right? We could definitely have a customer, a malicious customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's trying to get data or change some settings for other customers, right?
Yeah, intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah. What about other ideas?
We could have internal people who are malicious, or we could have completely external people who are trying to get access to our clients' accounts.
Yep. And anonymous users, anonymous attackers who are in between, for example, can intercept the communication between the customer and the solution, for example.
Mm-hmm. Would bots be a threat? There are like so many bots in the wild. Where would you put them? Anyway.
Just say yes, yep, they'd absolutely be a threat, and you could put them wherever you think they're relevant. Let me just. We've got a few more people joining late, so I'm just dropping them into rooms.
Incoming call from 01
Sorry about that. Any other ideas? So let's focus on spoofing. Who can spoof? Or who? Which of these elements could be spoofed? I think anything that's outside the trust zone could be spoofed.
Yep. So especially the items that go through the line of trust. So the communication, the data that is coming from the AWS, Office, and Azure APIs to the integration engine.
Tampering. So that, I guess that's pretty much along the same lines. Any data line that's going outside could be tampered with, either via the API if it's not a secure API, or
the communication between the customer, the ACME admins, to the management portal. I would actually, like, my first hit for a threat would be exploiting vulnerabilities in the management portal from the customer position.
using
so
customer as the
yeah. So I assume the management portal has to be a service. I mean, a web solution or any other API that provides some authentication, and then the customers can affect some settings in the management portal. For example, change the integration engine, add their new AWS APIs, or change the existing ones. So here, I wonder which category of Stride. I rarely use Stride, so I would say maybe information disclosure. So the customer trying to get data about other clients in the management portal, access control issues.
Is information disclosure more like there's an error message saying which version of what I'm using? Oh, it also could be information about other customers as well, I guess.
Yeah, or a unprotected backup of the whole management portal being exposed to the web, right?
Cool.
And it is also the best place to put denial of service threat. So if you want to deny other customers from managing their solution through the management portal, then just run a DOS attack there.
Yeah, I do agree. Management portal is the best place to do the DDoS, and one of the most vulnerable point in this entire design for the customer.
Actually, you can find all the threats from the Stride categories between the customer and the management portal, right? The last one is the best. So elevation of privilege. What if one customer logs in as an admin there, or as another customer? So that's also an elevation of privilege. So maybe let's focus on other parts of the diagram. What's there on the right? The sync between the AWS.
Could we have that the Stride list on the right hand side or somewhere in the screen? Is it possible?
Let me try, but it doesn't let me to have a chat room here.
That's okay. That's okay. Just checking because it helps us to understand.
Here? No, doesn't let me.
when I'm doing it, I mostly directly put it, or I try to put it on the diagram itself, so I know where it is related to. But in the end, it often gets messed up in case I get too many threads. So I think a bullet point list wouldn't tell us which communication is meant for which system.
I'm trying to mark it up. Oh no. I don't know if you see what I'm trying to do. I must be looking really. Oh, there is annotate. And you guys, I think, can also annotate on the screen.
Yeah.
This? Mouse. There's chat. I'm so sorry. This Zoom session has dispersed itself on 2 screens, which I never do. That is why I have been struggling. Kunvar Atul, the file is shared on the screen.
Can you see my annotations?
No, annotations are not seen. We can see the chat.
Currently, I cannot see the annotations.
Yeah, I'm trying to save it, but yeah, the thing is that the moment I'm trying to save it or finish the annotation, it gets it just disappears.
Interesting. Oh God. I'm gonna stop share and start again. Oh. Let's try again. Oh yes, I think this is better. Now I can see someone drawing something.
Okay.
Cool. Let's draw. Let's put like a spoofing. Oh. Let's put an S here. We basically think all the strike can happen between the management portal and customer or admins.
All right, maybe let's discuss this further while we work out the annotations thing. Okay, so we have the IAM solution and the Azure AD that is syncing with user IAM store in the solution, right? So definitely spoofing there, yeah. Any information disclosure there would also be interesting. So trying to get information about users that are from a different customer, or simply dump of all user data.
Mm-hmm.
If you put a denial of service there, there's also a way of
Like
making,
brute force.
yeah.
Repudiation.
As I could say that I didn't perform the synchronization. So I would assume it's also there.
Sorry, I couldn't quite get that.
I could, as a identity management system, say that I didn't perform the synchronization. I'm not sure what the threat will be, but maybe it is related to the users, that some users are not synchronized.
Yep. Yep. That's more or less denial of service, right?
It could be tampering as well, I think.
So like when it is denial of service, then you actually desynchronize the data stores, right? If it's tampering, then we're talking more about making the solution synchronize the wrong list of users.
So that's why I thought what he was saying was more about tampering, because
Okay, then, yep.
It's not the effect, but it's the cause. So the synchronization is messed up. So it is causing some, not DDoS or DOS, but it's causing some integrity issues. Information disclosure. So, okay. Repudiation. Whenever there is identity, I think repudiation would be a problem. So I guess that would be relevant here as well.
For the admins, I would say it is important to have repudiation, because an admin might be able to delete something in the management portal, and then it is important that he can't say no, I haven't done it. So we need.
Yeah, but for the customer as well, customer will have their admins as well. So that, I think it's important we can put the responsibility on customer as well, with the logs and audit logs. Elevation of privilege. Yeah, wherever I see identity, I think about this as well. So it's like everything can happen everywhere. We did.
Yeah, that's the main problem with Stride approach. Or trying to decide whether something is spoofing or tampering and spending 10 minutes on it. But it's all right. There is the API secret store on the left. So definitely information disclosure, right? Disclosing any secrets that are stored in the database.
Yeah. And how about the APIs? How can you, what could be the threats to unsecured APIs?
So as I'm understanding, the AWS, Office 365 and Azure APIs, they are like, do we consider them out of scope for this threat modeling? Because I'm wondering, like, we're doing a session, right? And the session is performed by, let's say, the owner of the solution or the customer, right? In most of these situations, the like AWS, Office, and Azure threats, they will be a little bit out of scope. I mean,
but this is those APIs that we've built and we're giving to the customers to use.
So that's built by the
It's built by
solution.
us.
Oh, right. Okay, I thought they were like generic APIs.
Well, we can ask, but my interpretation is that it's the APIs that we built so that our customers can use their AWS, Office 365, or Azure, or maybe GCP, which is not here. Okay, we have 25 seconds until we go back. I will save this. Okay. Save the screen. That is great. And we can check what the other teams have found.
Okay, that should be everyone back now. If you're not back, then please say so.
How can they do?
Right, hopefully some of you found that useful. I know I heard some really interesting discussions going on, and there were a few bits I wanted to pick up on. So the first one is threat modeling does not have to be low-level technical. This is the specific vulnerability that applies to this area, but it can be. I have done threat modeling workshops before where it's been applied to circuses or school trips or bank vaults and various others. It is an approach rather than a prescriptive set of techniques. The only reason to have a prescriptive set of techniques is when you have a set of standard technologies for which you know all of the threats. So it is adaptable. You can use it however you want to. The other thing, and this is one of the major misunderstandings that I keep coming across, and again, others may differ on this particular philosophy, is that threat modeling is not about risk management. Threat modeling is what you do before you do risk management. So the key to it is that a threat is something out of your control. And in one of the rooms, bow tie diagramming was mentioned, which I wasn't aware of, or at least hadn't come across by that name. But there, the term hazard is used rather than threat. But fundamentally, it's the same sort of approach, and it appears to be another list-based, brainstorming-based approach to it. But yeah, the threat is completely out of your control. What's in your control is the vulnerability. That's where it's a hole in your system that threat could potentially exploit. And the combination of those two is the risk. So when you're doing the initial stages of threat modeling, you are not trying to identify the vulnerabilities, and you're not trying to manage the risk that arises from those threats and vulnerabilities, because if you kick straight into risk management, what tends to happen is the same issue with solutionizing, although I hate that word, anything, where people get so focused on the solution, they can't, where people get so focused on the solution, they don't look outside it, and we are trying to get a bigger picture overall. Jonathan, yes, I think that would be. Dita, would you be able to? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
The next method that I mentioned earlier is goal-oriented methods, and there's really only one that I bother discussing here, but there are plenty of others, and it's one of the, again, more famous ones. These are attack trees, and you can do them either way up, but the point is, in this case, we're looking at, this was one that I actually did with a load of physical security specialists, and it was doing threat modeling for protecting a principal who happened to be a celebrity, a singer. Just a theoretical exercise, but the idea is you start with the goal, and in this case that goal is to access a dressing room. You don't have to have just one goal, but you start with the aim, the impact, the bad thing that will happen, or that the threat wants to happen, and then you simply work backwards. So instead of what we were doing with the library-based approach, where we're looking at potential holes and saying, well, what threats apply here? You are saying, what is it that the threat will cause? And then what enables that? So you've got breaking into the stadium fire escape, that gets them backstage. They can then get into the dressing room. You can apply controls around that, but ultimately it's that one step that gets them in. Then there's sneaking in the staff entrance. Well, in order to do that, they need to do certain other things. They either need to wait for it to be unmonitored so they can walk through. They need to buy a fluorescent jacket for £2 from a costume shop and walk straight in, preferably with a clipboard. Or they need to steal a stadium staff uniform, or maybe have been an ex-employee. So attack trees, it's much more about what do they need to do to get to the goal, and then what do they need to do to get to that step, and you work it all the way backwards. And again, you can do this at any technical level you want to. So you could say, well, they're going to steal the IAM data store, or they're going to steal a user's password. And in order to do that, what do they need? They need access to the communications. They need access to the data store. They need access to a particular server. Okay, how can they get that? Well, if they go through this jump server, if they compromise another user's account, any of these approaches. So that's the attack tree or goal-oriented method, and you will find different ways that it's applied, but ultimately that's what it is. So on that same diagram, hopefully you can see how it might be applied. Before we do anything else on that, can I ask if people came up with threats? And if anyone wants to talk about the threats that they discovered, whether it was useful to them, whether they feel that actually they already know all of the risks that apply to a system, and whether it's something that you might be using in anger in development at some point.
In our breakout room, we were more focused on very high level. What could be the categories of the strike that would be applicable for each of the points that are between trusted and untrusted?
So that's an interesting one, because that is absolutely useful, because what it does is if you know which categories apply, it lets you narrow down your thinking. So if you know, for example, that spoofing absolutely could in no way apply at a particular category, you just write off that whole lot and don't bother brainstorming. And it saves effort. It saves you chasing after things that really don't need any effort spent on them. Anyone else willing to talk about their own little workshop session? Everyone's so shy.
Maybe
Come
you
on.
should sing, James, so that people will open up.
If I sing, then no one's going to stay in this room. Guaranteed.
I wouldn't be so sure.
Well, if I sing, I'm not going to stay in this room. Let's go with that. Right. Are there any questions about the goal-oriented methods or the library methods?
Seem pretty straightforward to me.
It's one of those amazing things. Threat modeling is actually, I think, really straightforward. And whenever I end up explaining it to someone, almost always they go, oh, well, but that's obvious, or that's really straightforward, or that's common sense. And the answer is yes, it really is. And the whole aim of most of these methods is to actually get people to apply common sense when they're doing development, when they're doing design, when they're implementing something. Because a lot of the time people get, again, so focused on the end result, they don't consider the threats against it until 2 years after it's been developed, when security come along and say, but you've left the document store wide open to the world. Right, so Britain, how would you decide, or how would you explain when best to use the asset method and when to use library method? The asset method or the goal method is, I would say, usually the earliest you use. So the aim, or second earliest, we'll get to the other one. I was going to cover this later, but my general approach to threat modeling, when I'm given half a chance, is that the library method is the last stage before you go into risk management. The asset method is the stage just before that, because you are looking at the goals. And then rather than using an acronym, when I'm doing it in anger, I will tend to use a library of threats, and they may well be technical threats. The acronym is purely a way to brainstorm it when you're not doing any threat modeling and you haven't built up that library. So asset method, then library method, which will give you the specific threats, and you can map those against vulnerabilities, and then you're straight into risk management, but you're into risk management at the design stage, not at the, oh, well, we've built this, so let's spend 10,000 securing something when we could have spent 10 minutes before we started coding, closing down those holes. I'll skip the next exercise because I think we need to go into the motivation method for that to make sense. So motivation methods, there's various ones of these, adversary cards, or my preferred one, persona non grata. It's mainly my preferred one because it's fun to do, particularly when you start using people's real photos for it. And persona non grata is the step before that asset method, where you are saying, well, who are our potential threats? It could be an insider, could be outsider, could be almost anything, could be a government agency, could be some particular protest group. And the aim of it is you build up a profile of that person or of that group. You actually use a photo that you feel represents them. Now, you could use stick figures if you want, but photos are more fun. And develop the whole setup around it. From there, as well as their motivation, you say, well, okay, realistically then, how skilled is this person? What resources do they have available? In this case, we've got HH Hacker, who's an ex-employee. He was fired because he was Bitcoin mining on some of the company AWS servers without telling anyone. So he was kicked out for that, and he was previously part of the security team. So this basically says, well, obviously they've got technical skills. They will have had access to privileged security information. They will understand the architecture. They will understand the company procedures. They will potentially still have friends at the company who might side with them. And it's possible they weren't acting alone. So that gives you a very complete picture of what this person might want to do and what this person is capable of doing. From there, you go to the asset method or the goal method and say, well, what do they want to do next? And it's likely disgruntled ex-employee, they want to cause some damage. They know where to hit to cause the most damage. So you look at those areas. They also obviously want to make some money, otherwise they wouldn't be Bitcoin mining, but they've already been caught by that. So either they might not bother again, or they're going to change their tactics. So you've got options there. From there, you go back to the goal method. Right, this is their goal. How could they do it? Do they have the tools realistically to do that? And finally, when you've got the different steps there, that's where you start going into the library method and saying, right, in order to do this, in order to access this particular data store, they need to get to this jump server. And for these ones, they also need to go through the same area. So let's focus on that and do very low-level granular threat modeling, applying technical threats.
Window, James, there's a question in the chat window.
Yep.
If a customer of yours didn't know which method would suit them best, how would you explain when best to use asset method and when to use library method? So
my answer to that is you use all three. Use every method you can think of and you use them in sequence as appropriate. However, if you've only got time to do one, if you are looking at a detailed architecture diagram, library method without a question. You draw on your trust zones and you start going down and listing out every threat that you can think of, and you do it with the technical threats, because you will miss things. but you will catch a lot more using the library method than starting with a higher level method and not being able to get down to that detailed level. So does that help answer the question? I know I went off on tangent a bit before.
The goal
followed
method,
that
that's
clearly.
the same as
I'm a novice.
attack trees, right?
Yes, yeah, so attack trees, goal method or asset method. The only reason I say asset as well is because ultimately it's someone trying to compromise an asset, but you are saying what's the target or what's the goal of the threat rather than how are they going to achieve it. You work backwards to get how they're going to achieve it. Okay, any other questions on asset or list or library or the other one, motivation? Okay, so in that case, right. So I'm actually going to ask for some participation here. Can anyone give a goal, using that original diagram, a goal that a threat actor might be trying to achieve?
James?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, a quick question. We had a case down here in Costa Rica where a company was compromised. So the company I work at, they looked for us to see if we could help or try to investigate what, how the attackers actually compromised the organization, right? It is some sort of kind of ransomware. The question is, if you are gonna, I mean, in this case, the attack already happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to understand how those guys get into the network and what they're actually doing. Should you focus on, for example, assets, trying to see if you have applications, vulnerable applications or, RDP or any kind of misconfiguration that allow the attacker to get into the network once they are there? Or in the other hand, you should focus on try to understand the threat actor. What is the modus operandi? What kind of ransomware is that? How the files are actually encrypted? What is the extension? And understand, the attacker from that perspective once the attack has happened. I'm not sure if you see what I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay. This is a personal recommendation, so don't take it as the word of some authority. I would always try to understand the motivation of the attacker first, because that narrows the scope of the investigation. So if you can have an idea about their motivation and their technical ability, that means you can then start looking in the right places. Now, the big problem with this is actually identifying the attacker in the first place. And I don't think we have time for a whole workshop on that, and I'm not a digital forensics specialist,
Yeah.
so I'm going to hand that over and make that someone else's problem at a future workshop. But
Yeah.
it's
Michael.
understanding who did it and why. That's the most useful bit.
Michael, if you can take time after the session to put it on to Slack and we can discuss it over there.
Right. Yeah, because obviously part of the threat modeling is actually the learning stages after something happened. So in this case, the organization has been compromised with some ransomware. But how do you actually start the investigation from a threat modeling point of view? Focusing on what actually happened, what the attack left behind, meaning indicators of compromise, hashes and things like that, or actually how do they, how do they get into the network? Was it like an email with some attachment, or was it like a vulnerable web server that allows them to gain access to the network? Basically trying to understand if we want to create a threat model once the incident has happened, because at these stages, the guys, even the organization don't even know if the attackers are in the network already, right? So
Yeah.
If you look into that point of view, let's say it's an ongoing attack at the moment, but how do you tackle that from the threat modeling point of view, right?
Okay, so my view there would be almost you tackle it exactly the same as you would before an attack's happened. If you don't know the attack's happening, that's all you can do. If you do know the attack's happening, then just that exercise of brainstorming and thinking through what could be going on, again, it helps to narrow down the investigation. And the biggest thing you're going to care about in an investigation like that is time. So anything that reduces your search scope is good. But if I was actually doing it in anger, where I know an attack has happened, I have security resources to rely on because this is resource intensive, or technical resources to rely on, I would look at taking the security resources, segregating them out from the technical investigation, putting them on threat modeling with technical teams running around doing wide net searching, so looking everywhere they can think of that might be affected, and feeding the results of that investigation into that dedicated threat model. So they would be out doing a dragnet to find any indicators of compromise they can, any indicators of motivation, any sign they can of how the attack happened, and feed it into that central threat model to pull out an idea of what the actual motivation is, who the actor is. Because if you try and have that team doing the threat modeling side of it, also doing the technical investigation, it's the same thing again. People are going to get distracted, they're going to go down rabbit holes, they're going to over focus on a particular area and convince themselves that that's the answer.
So can I just chip in a couple of comments? So Michael, the reason, when you ask that question, do I focus here and here and here? My first answer immediately will be, you need to focus on them all, right? And the bottom line is, the way I like to handle incidents is I always elevate the type of incidents one up compared to what it is for the business, because I always put a lot more resources that initially you think you would need, because from an incident point of view, what you actually, it's almost like this conversation is highlighting that, right? So if you look at it from the stage of an incident, you actually need to have as many resources as you can find, because somebody needs to be looking at the incident situation, what happened. Somebody needs to be preparing the risk analysis. Somebody needs to be preparing the members for exec. Some of them needs to be doing the threat models. So I actually found that doing threat models in a security incident is highly effective for two reasons, right? The first one is everybody's really focused. And the second one, there's a lot of conversations that when you do a threat model, you talk theoretical, and then it's very hard to engage. Doing an incident is like, this just happened. It's like, it's not like it could or maybe not. This just happened, and then you need to find out why. And the reason why I always like to go very wide is because from my point of view, especially from a CISO point of view, every time there's an incident, I also want to validate a lot of my risks. So I'll give an example. If one of your risks is to accept that you don't have insider threats, right? Then during your incidents, as you go wide in your investigation, you're also looking for evidence of that, because that could be one of the solutions. That could be one of the consequences. And if you happen to find that it's insider threat, you actually need to kick off another instance straight away, because there's a lot of other stuff that could be happening that at the moment your model assumed that wasn't just possible, right? But doing threat models, doing an incident is highly effective, but it also shows that it pays to do it before. So I had some really nice incidents that it really paid to pick up all the stuff that we already knew, so we can go and say, look, here is what our landscape looked like. We believe that this kind of thing could only happen from there, there, and there. Let's look at the weak signals or the signals that we've got to see if they validate our assumption or not. And meanwhile, you should always have another team that is probably now ingesting data and building connectors, because guess what? The reason why you didn't pick up the incident is most likely because you had blind spots in your visibility. So I would also use the incident as a way to improve the visibility engine, your visibility capability and your automation on the data that you have, right? Up to the point where ideally the next incidents that are similar to that, you pick them up much sooner.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I guess in our case, it's a bit challenging, because if it was your own organization, you know how to model everything like that. But when you get to a third party, you don't know what kind of process do they have in place, and which is interesting. Which leads me to the other question. Sorry for taking the time to ask. is there any some sort of blueprints or already created like scenarios for, let's say, ransomware, or for example, in this case, Office 365 attacks and things like that? Is something already in place?
Dennis, did you seed this question, Dennis?
I promised I didn't. I totally promised I didn't.
The answer is sort of, and it really shouldn't be sort of. There are scenarios out there. There are people who've put together vague blueprints, but there isn't really a comprehensive library. So you've got something like, say, the ENISA threat taxonomy, which is really useful, but it's very one-dimensional. It's only looking at threats at a certain level. You've got OWASP cornucopia and the OWASP top 10. And again, it's only looking at that particular level. And you've got various things for doing instant response tabletops, for doing situation planning or situation testing. But they usually, once again, focus only at one level. It tends to be the management senior level there. So depressingly, to answer your question, not really. There aren't blueprints out there. It would be fantastic if there were, and it is definitely something that could and should be built, because one of the key things is you can build the components separately and link them together. You could say, okay, the governance piece is going to be pretty similar regardless of whether it's ransomware, information disclosure, etc. There might be some variation. The technical piece, you want a package and say, here's your ransomware, here's how it can happen. Now, yes, you have to do some work to apply that to a particular organization and particular technology, but just having that blueprint, it's a security design pattern, except it's a security design pattern for threat modeling instead of throwing a load of technologies into a diagram.
Well, that's one of the things I hope we can achieve with this summit, right? Like the bottom line is that if you take the individuals, if probably even on this call and throughout the summit, there's a lot of individuals that will have that experience. The biggest frustration is that every time we've done this in the past, it was done behind closed walls and the companies don't want to share it. So one of the things that we want to do with this summit is to actually create those blueprints. So we already got a Jira, we got GitHub, and look, fundamentally, like the way I look at it, it's actually not that hard, right? So the playbooks, the way we use it internally, and the way I've done it very successful, is literally a series of questions, right? It's literally a series of questions that you ask based on a particular event, and that's your playbook, right? And also who's to be answering them, right? And we actually do it with Jira, but you can do it with other ticketing systems. But we actually got to the point where we have a particular playbook where we clone, and then you got all the questions that you want to ask. And to be fair, right, the right playbook will always need to be customized for companies, because the questions you ask depends on what exists, right? Like if you have a single sign-on situation, then you have one place to ask this question. If you don't have that, if you don't have AD federated or whatever, then just even understanding who has access to what can be a massive problem, right? What you want is a series of questions and tasks that need to be done by whom when the event happens. And the reason we use Jira for this is because we track every one of those questions. Because if you don't do that, you get a gigantic Slack salad or whatever system you use, right?
Just to build off that, my dissertation was actually on threat modeling and how it can be used by non-technical people.
Yeah.
And I did quite a lot of research and quite a lot of work with people and came to almost exactly the same answer as Dennis has just given, but from a proactive theoretical point of view instead of instant response.
Yeah.
So it's an approach that works at both ends.
And I'll tell you what, it's also super powerful for non-security. So the nice thing of my role now is because I control both security and technology, I actually get to apply the same concepts in non-security events. So I have my security team helping with normal IT operational events, because the patterns are exactly the same. And the logic is always the same. An event happens, you go, do you have a playbook? Do you know the first 5 or 10 or 20 questions you need to ask? If you don't, you trigger an incident because you need to create it. And then the logic is next time the same thing occurs, you should not need to create a playbook. You can delegate it, right? You can just say, hey, here's the answers. Come back to me once you know the answers. And that scales because every time you do it, you get better. And the best part is also scales knowledge. Because, for example, if you're more experienced, you don't have to be involved in an incident to know if the incident is being well handled. I can tell by the questions being asked if they even go in the right direction, right? And also it's very easy to get a particular expert to help because we're just saying, hey, here are the questions we're asking. Here's what we know. What else should we ask?
Yeah, but that's actually a good point of view because again, like when you deal with third parties, for example, in our case, we do consulting services. You get sometimes involved in situations when you don't really know how the incident was managed. If they follow the right approach to deal with the incident from the very first stages.
But that's a competitive advantage, man. I would sell it. Look. The thing I kept saying to some of the third-party providers is I kept telling them, look, if you, let's say a pen test, right? If you do a pen test, if you deliver a graph, right, of the organization structure that you discovered, especially when you give them access, because again, remember the pen test, you give them access to the developers and everything else. So application security review, if you could actually give me a graph of what you discovered, that can be more valuable than the report you just gave me. Because in most organizations, find out who does what, who's responsible for what, who can do something, and who's making decisions can be sometimes the hardest part.
Yeah, definitely.
And it will change tomorrow, right? So even if you know today, we are there tomorrow, right? That's why it needs to be a graph, right? But cool, James, walk us through it. This is good.
I was actually going to say, I don't know if you've come across Andrew Powell, was the CISO for Maersk when Maersk basically went down.
Yeah,
and he does a great presentation about the lessons they learned. But that graph is one of the key ones that they picked up and made use of, because when they were rebuilding the company, and it was quite literally rebuilding all of their infrastructure, the way they did it was essentially by grabbing that social graph, and they just did it by going into, well, what WhatsApp groups formed. Okay, those are our new teams. Almost directly that, but that is that same social graph of how the company works, not the org chart, which shows the theory, but the practice. And then you document the practice instead of saying this policy should apply.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is the same at both ends, whether you're investigating an incident or planning for one beforehand or doing a theoretical test against one. You brainstorm what could have happened or could happen. You filter that down to what's plausible. You say, where are the actual vulnerabilities? So there's some discovery there, because even what's plausible, there may not be a vulnerability for it to go through, but you're not going to worry about alien invasion outside of certain very select circumstances. That gives you your risks. You then decide whether you're going to remediate, mitigate, however you want to manage them, and then you triage that remediation of them. So which one do we really need to fix tomorrow before the next wave of ransomware comes in?
So
and which one can we put off? Yep.
Quick one. So we discover vulnerabilities. Yeah, obviously there's going to be vulnerabilities, but you said this is not a risk assessment activity. But when you find the vulnerabilities, do you look at the likelihood of them being exploited, or do you just look at the number of them, severity of them? Or how do you take that?
I never bother looking at the number of vulnerabilities, and I very rarely look at the scoring of it unless I absolutely have to by policy. The likelihood of it being exploited, you are actually told by your threat model, so by your threat analysis. So if your expected threat actor has the capability to exploit that vulnerability, and you think that threat actor is going to target you or going to take effect, it's not necessarily a deliberate targeting, then you worry about that vulnerability. I don't care if it's got a score of low or high or whatever the score is, because that doesn't actually tell me whether someone's going to use it and what damage it will do. So yeah, it's the threat model is how you prioritize your vulnerabilities in an ideal world.
And the threat actor is super important. But in fact, the beauty of doing this on top of incidents, right, is that you got that data, right? Literally, you got the data, right? So basically,
good point.
If they're exploiting it, then the answer is yes. If they're not exploiting it, the answer is no, right? So, I think in security, sometimes we focus too much on what is possible. Not to say that's not important, but it's also important to take into account the threat actor and their motivations and the business they're in and your current threat landscape, right? And the reason that's important is so that you can focus on the things that will give you the maximum leverage instead of focus on the things that might be, might look very scary, but actually in practice, they're not that hard, or they're hard to exploit, or the business model to attack it is to exploit it. It's not very clear. Where actually some mid-level vulnerabilities may be so much more damaging to the business because they could actually be exploited and they could actually be weaponized and they can actually cause damage.
I want to pick up on something you said there about the business model to exploit it, because that's absolutely what it is. By doing threat modeling, by doing this sort of planning and brainstorming around it, you are saying, is there a business case for someone to use this vulnerability, to use this weakness?
Yep.
And if there is, someone's going to move into that market, I can pretty much guarantee it. And if there isn't, if it's not useful to them, well, don't need to worry about it right now. If you're in a company that has the capability, resources, everything else to solve 100% of your vulnerabilities, then great, do it. I'm fairly sure none of those exist, which means that everyone has to have a way of prioritizing what they fix first. And just going by a number plucked out of thin air is slightly unfair, but calculated of things which may be completely irrelevant to your company is not the best way to do it. It's not the most effective way to use your effort. It's worth putting time into thinking and planning before resolving, instead of just taking something someone else has set and said, this is the priority.
We had a question there. Have that been answered? If a customer of yours didn't know which method would suit them best, how would you explain them? Has that been answered?
I think so. The answer was use all of them.
Fair enough.
But Angel also had a question about your question, but it's...
I'm not sure what my question was anymore. It was a while ago.
I'm sorry, blame it on me.
I think Angel wants to say something, Angel?
I was just going to say that I'd forgotten the original question, and I thought that Michael we might just use him as the example to answer the question.
I think it's possible we did, so let's say we did.
But I think the talkers, I think the talkers covered it, if anything.
The thing I feel is very important on threat models, right, is that when you get this right, it adds a huge amount of value to the business. So my party trick, right, is to go to teams and ask them, do you understand the security implications of the features that you're developing and the application that you're coding? And then when they say no, right, or if they say yes, you go, okay, show me your threat models and show me your architecture diagrams, right? If they say, if they said, no, I don't, then I get them to accept the risk. And that's a risk that is not accepted by the developer team. It's have to be accepted by the business owner. And the business owners really don't like to accept that risk.
And it is a good threat model is a great tool to talk to a business owner as well. Yeah. Because saying we've got this risk and writing it out in technical language doesn't really get anywhere. They just don't necessarily understand it unless they're technical. But if you've got a threat model, you can abstract it a layer up and suddenly you're talking in business risk instead.
Hey Dennis, how they can accept the risk if they don't know what is it because there is no threat model?
Well, you have to accept the risk that you don't know, right? That's what you do every day, right? I can tell you today that you're accepting the risk, right, of catching coronavirus, right? Because nobody really knows what it is. So you're making that decision every day. So I view accepting risk, right, as a way to have a factual and a rational way of looking at risks. So if I go to you and say, do you have architecture diagrams of your application? Do you have updated threat models of your application? If you say no, I can say, the fact is that you don't know, right? Now, the only way to argue against that is to produce it, right? So you either have the data or you don't. If you don't have the data, you have to accept the risk that you don't have that knowledge. All right, now, and that's okay, because that's what was happening before this conversation, right?
Okay, you meant accepting the risk of not having the threat model.
Correct.
I thought about that they accept the risk of potential vulnerabilities or potential threats that they don't even know about.
Correct. Of not knowing.
Yeah.
All right.
So you have to accept the risk, but you don't understand the security implications of the new features or the application that you're developing. Now, if that application goes and gets deployed at the place that doesn't have customer data, that cannot cause a lot of damage, right? If it blows up or is attacked or is exploited, the damage is limited. I can say I can live with that. If the application goes to the heart of your data center and you ask the question, if this application gets popped, what's the side effect? If the side effect is now compromising lots of customer data, compromising potential revenue streams, or a lot of other damage, then you might argue that even that exec is not qualified enough to make that decision. You have to elevate to his boss.
The one thing I'd add is if you're accepting the uncertainty, you either need to be able to justify very well what the size of that uncertainty is, or it needs to be escalated up by default. Because if you've got unknown unknowns, assume the worst case.
But that gets mitigated by the environment, right?
Yeah.
Again, if an application doesn't test customer data, is not deployed into production, then the risk is low. Then I could argue that that's why there's a great conversation we've been having about the risk budget, right? So you could say that if an application gets deployed to an environment that is non-critical, you get this amount of budget for security vulnerabilities, right? And one of them is not having a threat model, right? Not having a threat model is a vulnerability in a way, because it means that you don't know what you know, right?
You can't realistically predict or understand what your risks might be.
Correct.
And are you now bringing risk budgeting into threat modeling? Because I'm pretty convinced it's a single holistic picture across the whole thing. But
well, threat model gives you the data, right? So I found the threat model is one of the best way to extract reality. And then you can do all sorts of analysis on top of it. One of them is risk assessment.
Okay. Any other questions? Rostam, is that a question or just accidental?
No. I just wanted to add that just that this might tie in really well with potentially with this conversation, is that this comes in as if we claim we have security by design and then we don't have a threat model, then this might be an issue in itself. So this comes within SSDLC. This comes with security by design. So it's an important.
I would argue if you haven't got a threat model, you're not doing security by design.
No.
Simple as that.
Exactly.
If anyone wants to disagree, then please go ahead, but I'm quite strict on that one.
I agree.
And if you look at the way we need to evolve as an industry, I actually believe that eventually most applications will have to publish their threat models. And because that is a great way to measure how much they understand the security landscape, right, that they are implementing. And in fact, I would argue from a defender point of view, it's only when you get a threat model that you can make good decisions. Look, I'll give you an example. One of the threat models I want to do later the week is on a product that we're about to release, right? We have released, right? Once you see the threat model, you realize that at the moment, that application cannot be used in a multi-tenant environment, i.e. an environment where you have users that don't trust each other. So I would argue that at the moment, that doesn't mean the application doesn't have value. It means that you cannot take, for example, the fact that the application has user accounts and user management, all that stuff at face value, because there's gaps and because the way, the testing is not as thorough as I want it to be. So if you publish a threat model that determines where the threats and the vulnerabilities and the risks are, right, then you allow the defender to make good decisions. If you don't allow that, you get what we have today, that you get some piece of technology with barely little instructions on how to use that thing. And then we go and you shove it in our infrastructure in a way that works.
I'd add that I'd argue threat modeling is the most valuable thing you can do in any sort of development, because if you do it, you've got a very clear idea of what your threats are and you can build to that. It gives you security as functional requirements. You can test it later on, you can build to that. It's great. If you don't do it, a threat modeling workshop is maybe 2 to 4 hours for almost any software solution, any architecture you want to look at. It's not a huge investment of effort. When you consider that you're then looking at months of development, and at the end of it, if you've not done a threat model, if you've not considered security right at the beginning, you are then looking at an additional few months to build the security on top, to try and layer it around, because you're trying to mitigate risks that didn't need to exist. So in terms of wasting resources, I have had people say to me that threat modeling is a waste of resources because they build in a secure way, which was a weird conversation. But by not doing it, you are wasting so much effort when you're developing anything, because layering security on afterwards just does not work. It will not close down everything, and it will be such a significant effort afterwards when you could have fixed it early.
So I fully agree that threat model is essential, but I would also add that it needs to be actioned. So there are many companies where I've seen that they had a requirement of building a threat model, but once the threats were listed, nothing was done with them. So they need to be actioned in some way, as you said, like verification through a penetration test, or simply going to security requirements and passing the security requirements to the development teams, and even more, checking if the developers actually follow the security requirements, right?
That's the breakdown between security and operations, though, which does exist, because that, in a way, is no different from saying everything must be centrally logged, and then you've got no one looking at those logs and analyzing them. Well, great, you've met the security requirement of everything being centrally logged, but it's completely useless. So yeah, I agree. You have to use something that you're doing, otherwise it's pointless.
You're muted.
You're on mute, yeah.
They did something, right? They chose to accept the risk, right? What you have to do is make it explicit.
Yeah, they implicitly chose to accept the risk.
The problem you just described is that you found a bunch of risks, right? And then you didn't do anything with it technically, but that's fine, because the way it looks, the way it works, right, is not. It's not the technical teams that determine the roadmap, right? It's not the technical team that determines what gets fixed. It's the business owner that determines. It's whoever controls the backlog. So until that person is committed and is interested, is motivated to address those things, right, nothing will happen. So you do the threat model, you find the risks, and then you translate them into business, language, and you get them to be accepted if they don't want to do something about it. And the best part is they will challenge, and actually they will challenge the risk in a way that sometimes security, we don't get challenged. Because sometimes it's very easy for us to throw comments and problems and risks and vulnerabilities. And it's when somebody says, well, if I'm accepting the risk, really quantify that, or tell me how much of that is certainty versus not. And I think it's also healthy for us security professionals to be challenged, to make sure that the stuff that we spit out, right, are actually, correct, right, and actually make sense, or are not exaggerations of reality.
I think the bit that's from producing the threat model is you have to put the risks or the vulnerabilities or whatever, or weaknesses or whatever you want to call them, into the system that the engineering or the product owner is using. And I know, Dennis, you're a big fan of Jira for that, but it's translating them into whatever whatever currency engineering are using for tracking of risks, for tracking of features, et cetera, as soon as you put them into that, then there is that visibility.
Yeah. But that is more, I would say that's more important, right, to put in the system. Although I've seen developers and Scrum Masters, they have a heart attack if you modify any of their tasks. So when you arrive with like 40 or 50 new things, they tend to freak out. So look, I take the view that it's about not losing data. Like I've done also implementation where we even putting the risks in the repo in the YAML file, right, for the developers, right? But the other thing that is very important to take into account is that you have to apply engineering resources to threat modeling, right? If you don't apply engineering resources to threat model, it doesn't scale, right? Threat model is a gigantic data collection exercise. It's a gigantic graph that you're creating. The beautiful part of it is that the more you do it, the better it gets. In fact, you know that you're in a good place where you don't start the threat model with a pen and a whiteboard and somebody doing some drawings, right? Or some documentation that is dramatically out of date, you know that you're a good place where you can literally go, tell me what systems are involved, and then you do a query and you go, Vroom, this is what I understand about those systems. Now let's do the threat model on top of this. And the beauty of this is the more you do it, the better you become, right? But going to your point, it's absolutely critical that you address in a language that is adjusted to the developers and the business owner.
I did have a couple more exercises, but honestly, I think the discussion's taken over and is probably more interesting than scattering everyone to breakout rooms. So yeah, any input on this, any thoughts on this, any questions about the whole thing, any challenges to anything that's been said, or any disagreements?
I'm loving it.
I mean, my big thing, because it has now come up a couple of times, Dennis, you've mentioned it, is around the ownership. And the problem that I've seen most of all is that ownership issue at the business level. Yep. Because business owners, firstly, are very hard to identify. And secondly, even when you've identified them, there's always that discussion of, oh, but this is a historical risk. It was there before I got here. Well, okay. Or why didn't you tell me about this earlier? What am I meant to do about it? And you can have all of those conversations, but it often seems to go down the route of, I don't understand this, or I don't want to accept this, but I also don't want to go and ask for the resources to fix this.
But that's why you have the risk management people. Those are the ones that make those visible.
And risk register.
Yep. No, I absolutely agree. But you have to have your process set up right to make that workable, because you can have a risk register, which is absolutely beautiful and has all of the Excel formulae and graphs and so on. But until you've got ownership and accountability, it's utterly worthless to anyone.
Exactly. Visibility is so important. And if it's not visible to the people who have the power, it's really worthless. Because the discussion doesn't start, the conversation doesn't start. You don't get the resources because they didn't have the visibility. They didn't have the chance to say, fix it.
Yep.
There's a very sweet spot, right? Which is when somebody takes responsibility for a new product, you have 3 months to really engage them. Because it's actually a nice sweet spot, because they, at that moment in time, they're more than ready to throw the previous, owners under the bus, because hey, they just inherited. It's very easy to accept problems that you didn't create, but it's very important that they also realize that within 3-month period, they will own all those risks.
They have to accept the consequence, not just the risk.
Yeah. Correct. And look, remember that fundamentally, it's a business decision, right? Fundamentally, our job is to allow the business to make fact-based and good decisions, right? If the business decides to run at a certain level of risk, in fact, that's their job, right? In fact, one of the things that you should be able to calculate, and Phil Higgins has some great thoughts about this, is you also should try to understand where is the line of the risk appetite for your business? Where is it? Because the bottom line is that if you let the business cross that line and operate in a way in a more risky scenarios than they're happy with, then you're doing a disservice to the business. In fact, you're putting the business at risk. But if you actually make the business operate below the risk threshold of the business, then you're actually slowing them down. You're actually causing a business damage, because you're making the business do things like reduce the risk, maybe at the place where the business doesn't want to reduce risk. And that's how you think in business. The way you think in business, look, if you look at fraud, right? Companies have to draw a line between usability and fraud, right? So you know that you make more things more usable, you're going to high degree of fraud, even on physical stores, for example, or online systems, right? The question is that fraud within the acceptable point of view? And I guess from a security angle, we always have to also defend the customer and data. Is that situation causing a problem with user data, which they shouldn't, put that into risk? Cool.
Sorry, it's boiling hot here at the moment. I'm slowly roasting.
So any other questions?
So do you want to go a bit more into the models then, James?
Depends which model. I mean, I covered off
The
Stride where you've got.
motivational ones?
Hmm?
The motivational one was with the person on gratas, right?
So the motivational one is fun. It's the most entertaining and it's the easiest to engage non-technical people with, because you are coming up with a fictional profile for one of your threat actors, for one of your attackers, and you just build it out as comprehensively as you can. So if we take an example, and this is an exercise everyone can do, if you just screenshot and capture Dennis in it. So if you do that now, right, that's your attacker. That's your hostile actor, your threat actor, whatever you want to call them. And let's see, what type is Dennis most likely to be? Script kiddie? You know, script kiddie using pre-prepared tools in a basement somewhere, just because we want to go stereotypical. So that gives you the start of the profile, and you add details from there and round out the character. Or, to be fairer, developer. In Dennis's case, let's say he's working on a product and you're worried he might be an insider threat. You can pick out any profile you want, but adding that picture helps people to relate to it, and building the profile in the right way, whether you do it as a wanted poster, whether you do it as a tabletop game character sheet, however you want to do it, makes it real for someone, and it gives you that way to talk to the business layer as well as the technical layer. So you can take that profile and say, well, here's the types of people, the types of organizations we think would threaten us. That's when you start going into the further threat models to say how big of a threat you think they are, or how much of a threat you think they are to your particular systems or a particular system in the company. But it just humanizes it, and it is a fantastic communication tool.
Do you have any favorite analogies you use?
I have analogies that I seem to have got a reputation for using around bees, but I'm not entirely sure it's fair to. Well, okay. Yeah, so let's say you're a beekeeper and your threat actor then, or your persona non grata, is going to be wasps, because wasps are awful, vile things which should be exterminated because they kill my bees. But you know how they operate, you know what their capabilities are, you've got an idea of where they are because no one lets a large wasp nest go unnoticed, and you can build up that profile. Then when you're looking at your hives, you can make sure there's the right entry points for them, that you can control where they can come in. You make sure that the hive is sized appropriately, because wasps are more likely to invade a hive which is underpopulated and therefore might be over-resourced, etc., etc. So that's an analogy I tend to use for just about anything relating to security or risk management. I somehow find a way to tie it to bees.
Interesting.
It's because everyone knows bees, or thinks they do.
Yeah, and how important they are for the environment.
There are some really good historical ones on threat modeling in Star Wars that various people have done, which are also seem to resonate well with audiences.
Yeah, I'm going to argue though that a 2-meter wide vent as the only exhaust vent is actually a perfectly reasonable risk to accept. I mean, if anyone wants to say it's not, that's fine, but that's an amazing cooling system, able to keep the exhaust for a moon-sized space station down to that.
Yeah, but with a direct line all the way to the main reactor with no, layers of defense, right?
No baffles or so on, but the air pressure coming out of that would have blown them out anyway, surely. It's an exhaust, air comes out, and you've got the heat exhaust of a whole space station of that size.
I think it was more. I literally saw that movie 2 days ago. But the thing about, for example, on threat models, right? One of the things I always look for is single points of failure, right? So if you look at that, when you analyze the threat model, the easiest ways to do it is to do the architecture diagram and then follow the stride, right? Follow, in a way, follow authentication, authorization, integrity, etc. And one of the things I always look for is single points of failure. So, what is the side effect of this happening? And what you really want to see a cascade, you want to see, in a way, multi-layers. So you actually need a sequence of events to cause a lot of damage. You don't want one particular event to trigger literally the main problem.
If you want an interesting way to apply that and take it non-technical, do that with an org chart and organizational decision making.
Yep.
Do threat modeling against that and see how many single points of failure there are, because it's usually about half the organization.
Although I literally have created risks for the business, saying the whole business, oops. Can you hear it?
Yeah, you're still here.
I was saying, like, the whole business depends on this, right? And you're right. Sometimes we find, in fact, I remember cases where we identified there was one dude in the company that understood how the thing works, like one. And if that person left, it would be a massive problem. And usually, you'd be the one that tends to be on the corner. Nobody, is paying attention. But it's incredible, right? So, in fact, threat modeling in an organization is really cool, because you find all sorts of problems. In fact, you can apply the same concepts of vulnerabilities, validation, data, input validation errors, all that stuff. You can find that organizational, because there's a fear that I have that I really want to get data, which actually correlates to the data that we collect from a security point of view and the performance that exists on teams and the performance that exists on managers. And we have some data now. I don't know if you see in the book Accelerate, where the guys really did a lot of stuff on DevOps, and they prove that the best teams are the teams that ship fast, they do security well, they document really well, they know how to scale, they know how to test, they do DevOps, they automate everything, they push continuous to deployment, they write tools, they run tools in production, all that jazz, right? And they are better teams. And for me, that's not a coincidence, right? They are better teams because they do all of that stuff. And they have better management because they understand and rewards that stuff.
Well, fundamentally, to do all of that stuff, you need better team communications.
Oh, yeah.
And team communication is really where it comes down to, because if you've got the right communication, you've got the right knowledge bases, you've got the right processes you're all following, you're a lot more resilient. And if you're more resilient, you are also more resilient to changes coming through. You can get them out faster or adapt to them a lot faster, rather than, let's say, a more robust team, which is much more, I've forgotten the term, much more solidified, much more rigid. So they might follow processes, but the moment you've got any alteration, things are going to break down.
Yep. And now I absolutely can't resist to show a worldly map, right? Which talks exactly about that.
I knew this was coming.
And by the way, if you don't know what worldly maps are, anybody, you absolutely have to join these sessions, because this is the thing that completely changed the way I think and operate and behave, and it's one of the most amazing things you can learn, right? So this is what in the worldly maps, Simon, which I was actually doing a bunch of sessions, right, in the summit. He's defined a number of doctrines, which he also puts into phases that what you can do. So these are things that you should do that can make a massive difference. And guess what? Use a common language is one of them. Focus on high situation awareness. You get that with threat modeling, right? A systematic mechanism for learning is threat modeling, right? Challenge your assumptions. Focus on user needs. Remove bias. Think small. All of these are things that you can do in threat modeling, right? And the power when you do this, and we want to do a session where we're going to do a bunch of these in practice, is that you can then map against your competitors or against other companies, and then you see how they face. And then, this can be the areas that you need to improve, and then it can be the areas that you can really focus. Because until you do some of these, you're always going to struggle. But it's spot on, right? Like using common language is one of the things I found that is the hardest part. In fact, when we do a lot of our work in Jira, we spend a lot of time on the graph just coming up with a language that makes sense for the team. There you go. I had to put in a worldly map in there.
Which is great. It is great. So if you were a new CISO to a company that is established in their old ways, how could you use that worldly map? How can you get a company who think they're in phase 4 to realize that they aren't even at phase 1 even?
You don't ask permission, right? In fact, the thing that I've always done is that you create a shield around your team and you operate in a certain way, because by proxy, that company is not prepared for it. So if you spend time arguing that you need it, you're going to waste time, right? What you want to do is operate like that. So I have to say that I think more in maps than sometimes they even been explained or they've been documented to the company. But it doesn't mean that I don't already behave in that way. And it takes a long time for a company to reach a level of maturity and understanding that they really embrace it. If you
show them how it's done, basically.
Sorry?
Show them how it's done.
Oh yeah, completely.
By doing it.
Yeah, and actually what I've learned is also you have to start with graphs, then go into maps, because graphs gives you the data. The data comes from connections, and then you map it out. But just simply thinking of your structures, of where you want to do, and the idea that you're commoditizing activities, the idea that you're moving things to the right, and more importantly, the idea that when things arrive at that commodity or products level, new things emerge on top, that's the key pattern that you want to see. But you try to explain this to somebody who doesn't get the maps or is basically part of the culture that created that problem, and they are 3 paradigm shifts away from even understanding it. So I wouldn't go there. Which
is actually quite odd, because it's a universal good practice. I mean, you look at project management, you look at enterprise architecture, you look at ISMS frameworks, they all say the same thing if you dig down deep enough.
You would think, right?
Well, they do. They definitely do. It's just people don't read the same thing out of them.
But I understand it now, man. It's in worldly maps, it's called attrition. There's an attrition of change, and past success breeds attrition. If something that worked for you, right? Something worked for you, you now have a resistance to change that.
Right?
You have
got momentum, inertia.
Right, inertia, correct. Right, and it's real, right? And it takes, I think there's only a certain individual. That's why when you look at the maps, you talk about the pioneers, settlers, and town planners. It's so true, because there are individuals that they happy to live in the pioneer stage, where you innovate, you fail fast, you do all sorts of experiments, but it's very messy, right? The outcome is not predetermined because you're going to experiment. There's very few individuals that sometimes are very comfortable there, especially in business, where sometimes the business has this idea that failure is a problem, right? And if you fail, you did something wrong, where the reality is on the pioneer stage, if you're not failing enough, you're actually probably not even trying hard enough. So that's the challenge. So and I think threat model is a good example, where it's a practice that, when you really look at it, the lack of threat model is a massive criticism to engineering practices, right? Because fundamentally, I remember once being shut down to shame with this developer team, where every question from a security point of view I was asking them, they said, you must be ridiculous. We do that, right? So what I mean data what I mean tampering. We validate all our data. Don't you validate all the data? What about authorization blind spots? Don't you authorize and validate every request? What do you mean we don't encrypt our data? Don't you supposed to protect the secrets? Literally, what it means we can't push to production. So I remember being really, sort of like, I don't know the right word, but I was super embarrassed, because everything I was asking, the correctly answer was that we do all of that because we have good engineering practices, right? So from a security point of view, I had very little value added to add, because they were doing it all, right? And that's when I really learned that security is engineering, right? Like most of the stuff that we talk about engineering, like a threat model, you should be able to do a threat model in 5 minutes with a team that has all the information, all the diagrams, diagrams created from data, all the stuff is up to date. They understand their risks, they understand their threats, they understand the validation. Look, you can literally do one very quickly, the problem in the real world, right, is most apps you ask how the thing works, right, and they start drawing it.
The developers need functional requirements to get a functional software, and they need security requirements, which resonate from the threat model, to get the secure software, right?
Yeah.
Security requirements are functional.
Yeah, they're both. They're an extension.
Yeah, they do not belong with non-functional requirements, and it's a bad idea to put them there.
Yeah. But so if you look at a lot of security properties, right, they in a way they're non-functional requirements, or they things that the application should do. Some of them are functional, some of them are non-functional, right? It depends where you're looking at, right? And of course, there's multiple areas of security.
Yeah, I'm not putting them separately. I just meant that, like, if there are no security requirements, most of the team will fail at building secure software, right?
Yeah, because you're not asking them to. So it needs to be part of your requirements, but requirements gathering is always the bit that goes wrong first.
But I will caveat that to say, if you have really strong engineering requirements, right, that will give you lots of security. The problem is very few companies do really good engineering requirements. And that's the challenge. The challenge is sometimes in security, we have to understand that what you're really criticizing is how they develop software. What we're really criticizing is the fact that from an engineering point of view, you know, that architecture or that system is really not very good, right? Especially when you compare with what they should be doing. And the irony today is we have data, and we know, because you look at the best companies in the world, is that when you get good engineering, you will ship faster, you will have happier customers, and you will have more secure products. But in a lot of applications, it's a mess because they've been developed over years and years and years, right? The people who wrote it is not even there anymore, right? Even sometimes projects that start fresh, they become legacy, right? Within 6 months.
Yeah.
And in fact, today, if you don't have a team that every October or November, right, after AWS reInvent, right, that's a reset to basically readapt to the latest stuff that AWS has pushed out, or the cloud providers, that team is already going to be legacy within 6 months to 12 months. Because they're already not adapting, not using the innovations that the platform has gave them. And sometimes it's okay to choose to ignore it, right? It's okay to say, we're not going that way. You know, Lambda was great for here, but we're going to do it over here because of these limitations. But that should be a conscious decision that you make.
I hate to be one of those people that's strict on time, but I've got another call in 9 minutes. So if anyone does have any questions, challenges, philosophical points, now's the time to throw them in.
So I want to promote some of the other sessions. So we will have other threat modeling sessions, but this one was specifically for a series of events, which will. This was a session where we understood about this managed services company and their threat model. We thought about it a little bit. Next one in this series will be to come up with an incident scenario. And then next week, Wednesday evening, we will be doing an incident response exercise with lots of actors, not just the threat actors, but with the people from internal to the company, this fictitious company. And we will then, in the summit week, the last day of the summit, we're going to do a post-mortem. But if you go to the Hey Summit site, where you registered for the event, there are other threat modeling introduction talks this week and next week. And also there are introduction to worthy mapping talks as well. And I do encourage you to have a look at them if you work in technology or want to work in technology. Yeah, there are lots of good sessions. And I do want to take a group picture if you guys also want to. So anyone who is willing to, you can open your videos so we can take a nice picture together. And you can all talk at, oh, of course.
I like your background, Daryl.
I've got quite a few of them. I've got the whole Star Wars series now.
I was gonna say, yeah.
I have a few too.
I still think
I keep meaning to grab that one for when I'm on calls with work.
I still think
My
the best one is when my
Yeah.
kids at school that
It's quite one of the good ones.
one of them made.
That's how I feel normally.
Everything is fine.
Yeah,
Normal.
Are we ready?
yeah, we're good.
So 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna take another one.
Right.
3, 2, 1. Cool. Thank you all joining us for the first ever session of this year. It's been good. I hope you also got value. I have not done threat modeling before, so this was a really good introduction for me.
I found it the same.
Yeah, quite productive.
And
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. I will stop the recording now, but you guys can stay. I will keep the line open for another 10-15 minutes if you want to discuss anything or just banter.